Hey there. Welcome to The Climate Cycle, a podcast focused on Canada's climate tech ecosystem. In each episode, we sit down with founders building climate solutions right here in Canada to better understand the challenges presented by climate change and what we can do about it. Today's guest is Mike Kelland, founder and CEO of Planetary. Planetary is a carbon removal startup that's aiming to draw down gigatonnes of carbon from the atmosphere by accelerating the ocean's natural carbon-absorbing abilities. To do this, they're using a process called ocean alkalinity enhancement, where they add alkaline materials like crushed limestone into the ocean to convert dissolved CO2 into a stable form, allowing the ocean to soak up even more CO2 from the atmosphere. Planetary is using this process to draw down some of the 8 gigatonnes of CO2 that we need to remove every year by 2050 in order to hit our climate goals. So far, we've removed about 12 megatons of CO2, and the carbon removal industry is laser focused on solving challenges of cost, scale, and durability. Ocean alkalinity is relatively new, with lots of technical and measurement problems to be solved, but it's one of the pathways with the greatest potential for gigatonne-scale removal. I sat down with Mike back in February at a climate meetup I host in Ottawa. I'll add a link to that in the show notes. We had a great audience full of founders, investors, and researchers and got to take some of their questions. In our conversation, Mike unpacks how their technology works, the challenges of measuring carbon removal in the open ocean, and their approach to scaling physical plants on coastlines around the world. Now, over to Mike to introduce Planetary.
Our vision is to restore the ocean and the climate for generations to come. So that's sort of our mission, vision, what we sort of focus on doing. The way that we do that is that the way I often describe it is that the ocean essentially breathes. So if you think about the ocean as an entity on the earth, as it flows around and does its thing, it breathes in everything we put in the air. And when we put a lot of extra CO2 in the air, it's going to breathe that in, and it's going to create essentially acidity within the ocean. So as we put more CO2 in the air, it acidifies the ocean and makes it not really very hospitable to all the things that live in there. What we do is we actually reverse some of that acidification. So we add an antacid, essentially, to seawater. And now I'm mixing my medical conditions here. So we breathe in CO2 and it gives it heartburn, which I know is not quite the way it works with us, but that's how it works with the ocean. And as we add that antacid back into seawater, we're actually reversing some of that acidification. What that antacid does is it neutralizes some of that CO2 in the seawater, and it essentially makes more room for more. And then everything balances back out. The ocean can breathe again and pull more CO2 out of the sky. And so the net effect of that is actually removing this acidic CO2 out of the entire system. So out of all of that work we do, the net effect is there's less CO2 in the entire system, but most importantly, we've taken it out of the most dangerous place for CO2 to be, which is in the air, and we've stored it as bicarbonate in the ocean. I'll preempt one of the questions, because the very first question we get all the time is this safe? Should you be putting carbon in the ocean? Is this a good idea? And the ocean actually stores, and this is one of the factoids you guys can bring home to your families, but the ocean stores the majority of the carbon on the surface of the earth. And so there is about 50 times more carbon in the ocean than there is in the atmosphere. And the way that it gets there is actually through a process of rock weathering. So the process that we kind of replicate is a natural process on Earth, where when rain essentially dissolves CO2, forms that acidity, goes down on rocks around the world, which are slightly basic, weathers those rocks and ends up as bicarbonate in the ocean. That's how all that carbon ends up in the ocean. And that's a really important building block for everything that makes a shell or a bone in the ocean. And this is sort of how we get essentially life within the ocean. So it's a really critical component of what the ocean ecosystem needs. And what we're doing is really trying to help to restore the ocean back to the chemical composition that it had before all the CO2 went up in the air. So that's kind of the high level review of what we do.
That's perfect. I really like the way you explained that, because compared to other methods of carbon removal, you're kind of enhancing an existing system, as opposed to, the mineral is not necessarily what is being stored in the ocean. It's kind of accelerating this natural process. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got started in this area? And then there's like a million different pathways for carbon removal. What stood out to you about ocean alkalinity? Thank you. Yeah, what stood out to you about that, and kind of why did you double down on that take?
my pathway was kind of, in 2018, the IPCC report came out and said, hey, if we want to get to 1.5, we're going to have to remove a lot of carbon from the atmosphere. Like, this is going to be really an important part of the whole process. Reducing is never going to be enough. We need to also remove. And we started to look at that, and it was a really scary report when it came out. It was sort of like, this is a big deal. And I was looking for my next thing to do. I'd sold a company and in the software space, and I was like, what am I going to do next? And it looked like this was something that was, it was really important. It was close to me in terms of being somebody who spends a lot of time in the outdoors and gets out into, the canoe as much as possible and all that kind of stuff. And it was focused on my ethos. So I had no clue. I had absolutely no idea about anything climate whatsoever. And so I just started with our co-founder at the time, Brock. I just started calling scientists. And we just started calling scientists around the world. And we'd end every call by saying, can you tell me 2 more people who are in this space that I should talk to? And we just had this continual sort of cycle. And every spare moment we were just phoning. And it took us about a year. And eventually I ran into Dr. Greg Rao, who's my co-founder in the business. And Greg said, all the ideas you have are kind of dumb, but this one's really good because I wrote a paper about it, so you should do this. And so I read his paper and I said, hey, this is really cool. Like, this really fits what we're trying to do. And then from there, it's been a 5-year journey of really just, I call it a simplification journey. It's just been a journey from there of taking the original ideas from the academic space and applying them continuously and then iterating to make it simpler and simpler and simpler and simpler as much as possible over the course of that 5 years. And I think at this point, we've really sort of gotten to a point where we've got something that is incredibly scalable, incredibly cost effective, that is very safe, very restorative to oceans, and really fits all of those criteria. So we're really sort of accelerating with that right now. But that's been the journey for us as we've gone.
So maybe building on that, the big thing that I think of around the ocean-based carbon removal is it seems like a very promising pathway for a bunch of different reasons. You just went through the process of raising a Series A back in the fall. Maybe you could kind of like tap into that experience. Like, what's the bull case for ocean-based carbon removal, and kind of how do you break that down for investors and other folks that you're kind of sharing this story with?
Yeah, I mean, I think oceans, when we first started, and I hope that we're blazing a trail to make it easier for everybody else right now. But when we first started, it was like super weird, right? Like, it was like, not that everybody's doing DAC, which is great, but like, we're going to need a lot of different solutions in order to solve for climate. And we really, I think, have a few first principles that we've worked with in order to get to this point. So we've biased ourselves to say, what is the most scalable and most cost-effective way to remove carbon from the atmosphere? And that's not necessarily the same first principles that everybody else works from in this space. Because if you really dig into it, you're like, okay, most scalable, most cost-effective, then you're going to deny different things like, is this going to be socially acceptable? Can you measure it well enough for, a buyer to actually purchase it? Is it going to, harm ecosystems or anything like that in the process? And so what we've had to do in order to stick to that first principle is really have some bets and some theses on those things, which are very much turning out to be true, which is kind of like a really lucky thing. Or maybe I'm a genius, I don't know, but probably luck, mostly luck. But also we've kind of had to, like I say, we had to trailblaze in that way. And so from an investment perspective, I think that's always the bet for us. There are these big risks along the way, but it also has the highest reward, right? So when you look at all the various different forms of carbon removal, and you look at things like the state of CDR and how they, rank these things in terms of scalability, the ocean stores something like 89% of the carbon on the Earth's surface. So, and it's 73% of the surface of the Earth. So it's like, this is where all the carbon is. And so it's going to be by default the highest scale solution that you can get to, right? And the form that we're putting it in is the form it is in that ocean. So biological carbon in the ocean is a tiny, tiny fraction of that. The vast majority of that is actually mineral carbon in terms of bicarbonate. And so this is the largest reservoir for carbon on the surface of the Earth that exchanges with the atmosphere. It's the mechanism that is the most sort of powerful mechanism. And so if you're starting from that first principle, like, that's sort of where you end up, is like, okay, let's go and do the highest scale thing we can do, which is kind of by default going to be the cheapest, because as you approach limits in various different pathways, you're going to increase costs, right? And so as you hit those limits, and the lowest hanging fruit is always the cheapest, and then it becomes much more expensive. So it's almost in some ways the complete inverse of a lot of the biological processes, which are not very scalable at all, but are very cheap and easy to start, right? Like that kind of thing. So it's sort of like these inverse of the process. And so some of our first principles with this have been that this is going to be measurable, right? And so now we're proving measurability in the field, which is really cool. We didn't even think we'd be able to do it by now at the scale we're at, but we're actually seeing the carbon being removed from the atmosphere right now with measurements. And so that's really a huge breakthrough over the course of the last about 6 or 8 months. We're seeing that the climate relevant scales are imperceptible in terms of their impacts on biology or positive. And so this was our premise going in, but there's been roughly 10 times as many papers on OAE over this year than 5 years ago. And so it's an exponentially growing curve in terms of the research that's happening right now in this space. And the things that are showing biological impacts are when the system is pushed beyond what is feasible or possible to do in the field. And so that's a really interesting kind of like thing. It's like, hey, the oceans are really big. And everybody's like, yeah, I know they're big, but like you're doing things. And it's like, no, they're like really big. And they move around and they dilute things and stuff like that. And so the biggest challenge you always have is actually finding a signal. That measurement piece is actually the harder piece. The biological impact piece is going to be a long time before we hit that. And then the last piece is social acceptability. And in our journey, we've had a lot of ups and downs with that, right? Like in terms of where you go and sort of, where you do these things really matters, and how you engage with local communities and make sure that the benefits are shared and all these things is absolutely critical when you're working in an open system. And so, that open system component is one of the things that brings down your cost, increases your scale. But the trade-off is that you're working in the environment. And so you need to be heavily engaged with local communities. You need to be respectful of local communities, and you need to be sharing the benefits with the communities that rely on those areas. And ultimately, the goal is that the benefit of the project, provides a benefit to the local community. One of the projects we're doing right now is really heavily focused on oysters. And so we're looking at how our projects can enhance the growth of oysters in the Elizabeth River in Virginia. It goes into the Chesapeake Bay. Oysters are a really big deal there. And there's a lot of excitement from the local community in terms of, hey, this is like something that actually is going to make these waters a lot more hospitable to oysters and oyster growth as a result. So, it's a lot of that kind of work that we have to do to realize essentially the first principles that we're working from.
Cool. Thanks for that overview. I want to dive into the project side. The community benefit there seems very meaningful, but could you just maybe double click on the measurement side? You mentioned you've kind of hit some like notable milestones recently, and the measurement side in an open system seems like the hardest nut to crack. Could you kind of like dive into the specifics there and kind of like the progress that's been made?
Yeah, for sure. It is a hard nut to crack. I think maybe to take a step back, and I was having this big conversation about this today, so I'll just sort of recap a little bit of this. The measurement piece, when you measure something, you're always going to be measuring that, at the place that you're doing it, right? That sort of measurement. But no matter what kind of carbon removal we're talking about, even, the most closed possible systems, they have a goal, right? Which is to change the concentration of atmospheric CO2, right? That is your goal. And so no matter what, you're going to be working in that whole system. Some systems can get away with constraining their measurement boundaries and the boundaries of the system. A lot of them can't. So anything ocean, river, anything that's, wastewater plant, anything that is doing ocean-based system, ultimately, if they want to truly understand what their impact on the atmosphere is, right, they can't draw too close of a line around their system because it's going to operate in that whole system. So every system fundamentally is at some level an open system. I mean, even something like a geological sequestration of CO2 from DAC requires modeling to understand where the CO2 has ended up in the subsurface, whether it's staying there, whether you have leakage. So there is an open system component to everything you're doing. And so what you're trying to do with measurement is you're trying to show as much of an indication that your complete system model is accurate as possible, right? So for us, we're looking at a wide variety of measurements across our system. The most interesting one is looking at the depletion of CO2 within the plume for us. So like as the water exits the plant with the alkalinity in it, the sensors that we use pick up the fact that we have taken the concentration of CO2 from, in that region, it's supersaturated in seawater, so it's about 520 parts per million, down to about 300. And then when we stop dosing, it slowly comes back up again, right? And that's I think it's a really cool measurement to be able to look at and say, we're seeing that depletion, we're seeing that carbon being removed from the system. And then it's going to have to fully re-equilibrate, which is going to take between 4 months and 2 years to happen. And that's going to be captured within sort of a very well-calibrated model where you're doing things like looking at gradients between salinity and alkalinity and understanding how that gradient is perturbed over a large area so that you can see that the alkalinity is spreading. You're doing things like proxies, like looking at dye tracers that can be studied at very, very low concentrations. And then you're looking at what's called CTDs or sort of your temperature and salinity at different pressures or depths, essentially. And those are how you sort of baseline these models and you understand where the water's moving and all this other stuff. So it's quite a complicated process, but measuring all of these pieces is what tells you when you bring the model together to assemble all of that together, how accurate ultimately you are with that whole measurement system. Was that the question, or did I go completely off base? Yeah. So this is really exciting. We're going to announce this next week, so don't tell anybody yet. So we're a top 20 finalists for the X Prize, and we actually hit on January 29th. The deadline was January 31st. We hit our 1,000 tons on January 29th. So very exciting. And it was really hard. And the one thing I take away from it, I will say, I know there's some founders in the room. There's some people who are really focused on this. I do a lot of talking and sales and fundraising and all these kinds of things. I spent 6 weeks on site emptying bags of alkalinity into our tank in order to make this slurry and monitoring the sensors and all this kind of stuff in order to do the push, because we needed all hands on deck in order to get to that push. And at first I was really worried that we would be distracted. We wouldn't be running the rest of the business. We wouldn't be doing the things we needed to do. And it was the best thing I could have possibly done. It was unbelievable. It reminded, I think, the whole company as to why we're even doing what we're doing. All the other stuff, no, this is what you're trying to actually do, is like unclog a pipe at 2:00 in the morning when it's like -20 out, blowing wind. That's the job. That's what we're trying to do, is remove carbon from the atmosphere. And so it was a really great system. Like it was a really great time. It brought everybody together. It focused on us on, I think, what was really, really important. And we learned an absolute ton about things, about how our system works. We've actually figured out that we've dropped our cost by half as a result of that time. And that's really, that's exciting, right? And that's what that sort of pressure does. It brings the team together, and then you start to learn things about how to optimize things. You start to learn things that you didn't expect about your own system. And it's just been an absolutely incredible experience.
It's interesting to hear you talk about the real world, like unclogging something at 2 a.m. and realizing like we're moving atoms. That's the real work of making some of this stuff happen. And it's not the Zoom meeting or whatever around it. It's out there in the field.
We got some really great questions from our live audience. I'm going to summarize a few of them now, followed by Mike's response to the room. So the first question was about how Planetary's tech scales. So with physical plants located around the world, what does that look like 2 or 3 years in the future and at scale?
So the way our process works is that we use byproducts of existing industry that have alkaline components. And so we have a technology that essentially extracts just pure alkalinity, calcium and magnesium-based hydroxide is essentially what it is. These are the two most common ions in seawater after sodium. So these are kind of, very much very normal part of seawater. And so we extract these very sort of pure ions out of alkaline byproducts. Think like demolition wastes, mining residues, lime kiln dust, steel slags, like fly ashes, like these things that have like an alkaline component. So we extract that out. And then we partner up with wastewater and cooling water organizations that have an outfall into the ocean. So for example, our project where we are unclogging the pipes is in Halifax, and that's at Tufts Cove Generating Station. And the system that actually is on site is very simple. My chief scientist likes to call it a tank on a tarp. And that's all it is. It's sort of like a tank full of alkalinity that is got a very precise dosing system and a whole raft of ocean sensing systems, real-time permit compliance sensing, like all this kind of stuff. But really what it is like a tank on a tarp. And that very simple system essentially just doses very carefully the alkalinity within the permit limits we have into the local ocean. So the system, when you look at scalability of a system like this, there's basically two things that we have to look at. Is there enough alkalinity? And can you put enough of it in the ocean? So I'll do the second one first. So within existing permit structures, so what we're doing is very normal for wastewater plants. Wastewater plants adjust their alkalinity all the time and they use the same products as we do in order to do that. We just do up to the top of their permit. They do it to the very bottom of their permit because they don't want to spend extra money on alkalinity. It's their largest cost. And so within existing permits in the US, based on how much water is discharged from all the existing pipes, you can do about 7 gigatons of carbon removal per year. And we don't have to change the permit structure at all. I don't need a new permit to step offshore. The ocean probably can't take that, but the permits would allow it. Because permits don't look at what's right next to you. They look at your own thing. And so you sort of start to scale up, you have to go down. The coastal ocean, in order to do a gigaton of carbon removal, we would need about 30,000 kilometers of coastline. So with 1.6 million kilometers of coastline around the world, there's a lot of coastline. We can distribute it pretty easily. Now that depends on ocean conditions and, how much things mix and where the currents go and all kinds of stuff like that. But, at a high level, about 30,000 kilometers worth of coastline to distribute about 1 billion tons worth of carbon removal. So that's sort of like the ocean is roughly infinite on this. The state of CDR says that OAE, if you could spread it evenly across the whole oceans, would be 100 gigatons a year scalability without too much of a problem. But then you'd need boats and all kinds of things, and that's expensive. So keep it to the coasts, use existing permits, stuff we know that's safe, benefit local communities, all that good stuff. That's our strategy. Alkalinity side, there is about by 2050, the expectation is that if we stay on this track, right? So under 2 degrees Celsius, if we stay under that, there will be about 1.3 gigatons worth of carbon removal in existing waste products that we can utilize per year, located on the coast. There's about almost 4 gigatons of it will be produced worldwide, but like the stuff that's actually sitting on the coast, which is nice and economical for us, is about 1.3 gigatons. So even without moving to new technologies that can produce alkalinity without a high carbon footprint or mining new rock or anything like that, we can use byproducts and still hit over gigaton scale. So those are really two of our scalability things. In terms of our own technology, we've got a few patents on the extraction technology and how we pull pure alkalinity out of the system. We've got patents on how our modeling works and stuff like that. But apart from that, it's actually very low capex, very, very simple. I think we're I don't know, if you're in the winter and you have to heat the people, that's the energy cost for us, right? There's almost no energy within the system. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at. A gigaton scale, it would be a lot. I mean, I think it's on the order of depending on the scale of the system and the ocean and the modeling we've done, it's on the order of about 5,000 facilities worldwide, which is not crazy, but it's a few. We have 25 years to do it. We can scale to a gigaton in 25 years, right? Easy.
The next question was around Planetary's business model. So it sounds like it's not super capital intensive to get a facility going. So is the business model about investing capital expenses upfront and then monetizing over time? Or does a facility partner buy the unit from Planetary? So that means, are they looking for thousands of customers to buy and implement their solution, or getting 1,000 partners to offer up the land for Planetary to actually run the facility?
So the model right now, I'm a very big believer that you have to do the thing before you can enable other people to do the thing. And so there's been a lot of, in our space anyway, there's been a few companies that have tried to go out and say, oh, we're going to enable this, but they've never done it. So they fail typically, and that doesn't work out very well. So ultimately what we want to do is license our technology, but we're not going to do that for a while. We're going to be running projects for a while. We're going to be doing sort of build outs and our own projects for at least the next 3 or so years. We are starting to talk to large industrial organizations that could license the technology and do it themselves. But like I say, I think we want to perfect it a little bit further before we do that. But that's the ultimate goal is to license the tech and allow others to do it. There's a lot of interest. I mean, it's quite interesting in the project space, and I come out of the software space, so this is all learning for me. But when you get into projects and project development, there is a lot of interest from people in doing this. Even things like Indigenous communities are very interested in owning and running these operations, right? When we talk to them and say, hey, this is what this could do, there's the values and the co-benefits, but also there's a monetary benefit to doing this. They're very interested in sort of running these projects and moving forward with them. So that's a really, I think, a really interesting partnership. But there's also when you look at wastewater, there are massive companies that manage huge numbers of these facilities as wastewater engineering companies and things like that. And there's a lot of interest in sort of them taking this technology and bringing it to their customers.
Another really interesting question we got was about the full life cycle accounting of Planetary's carbon removal and how deep that goes. Life cycle accounting means not just looking at how much carbon was removed by your carbon removal tech, but also the emissions from building and operating it. There's more obvious factors like emissions from transportation, extracting the minerals, or the steel that's used in Planetary's tanks, but maybe also some more nuanced factors, like if you're taking an alkaline substance out of the environment and that ends up creating more soil acidity, does that impact the carbon uptake in a different carbon cycle? And is that something that Planetary has to think about?
So, little story, one of the reasons that we've managed to drop our costs by half is that we cut our allocation of carbon to the system by half. And that's actually one of the major things that happened. And the way we did that was actually to go deeper. So when you look at a life cycle analysis, because I'm sure not everybody in the room is an expert at life cycle analysis, but when you look at life cycle analysis, as you said, there's counterfactuals, right? So what's going to happen to this material if you don't use it, and the environment that it's in? There is attribution. So like, are you, by taking the waste, will you create more demand and therefore increase the scale of the primary product? And therefore you have to allocate emissions from the primary product to the waste. There is transportation, and there's layers to transportation, right? So if you do your first layer, and this is one of the things that really cut our numbers down, is like, you look at your first layer of transportation, somebody's like, oh, well, from here to here is this much, and that's sort of the metric. But then you go down to it and you say, well, actually, we got Justin to drive the truck and he actually took a shorter route and therefore we reduced our footprint. And so if you really dig into it, you can start to reduce things. We've got somebody who's focused entirely on LCA. It's his full-time job. It's all he does. And when I look at the spreadsheets, my eyes go squirrely. Like, we go super deep on this. Like, every single bolt. Like, I've spent a day taking pictures of all the tools we've bought. And so that we can understand the materials in them and understand their weights and see how much carbon they allocate towards, the footprint of the site, right? When I fly to Halifax, that's included, and it's a subtraction from the net tons we deliver to customers. Like, that, it is an incredibly detailed LCA process. And, we can dig in and talk about ISO 16042-2 and, value allocation versus like there's so much depth to it. But, for us, what we have to do is, it's one of the interesting things about this world is you need trusted counterparties in everything that you do, right? Especially for something as complex as LCA, you need a third-party verifier who's going to look at all of that and back you up and say like, no, that's not okay, or yes, you can claim that, or you can do it this way. Because otherwise, you're either going to be heavily negotiating against yourself on this stuff, or you're going the other way and you're not going to have an accurate number of your actual net impact on the atmosphere. But yeah, it's really important to us, and we do an awful lot of LCA work.
Building on this theme of quantifying carbon impact, the next question was about how ocean alkalinity enhancement stacks up against other carbon removal methods like direct air capture. There's a ton of different technologies out there being tested, but the winners are going to be the ones that can remove carbon at the lowest cost per ton. So how does the cost of deploying ocean alkalinity enhancement stack up to those other methods? How much can that cost come down? And how much land is this all going to require?
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, one thing that actually plays in a little bit to this, but for oceans, and you'd asked this kind of part of this question, oceans are very efficient at capturing carbon. And so calcium and magnesium bicarbonate only exists in solution, which is what the form that we're creating. And that's bicarbonate. So you get 2 carbons for every magnesium or every calcium on a molar basis. And so and because it's not all bicarbonate, it's sort of like 1.8 times more efficient than forming a carbonate on land or something like that. But in terms of comparisons between CDRs, and I have a lot of very good friends that are working on DACs, and some of them are in the room. So I don't want to be like, too sort of beating my own drum here. But as I said at the start, it comes down to what you're really trying to optimize for, I think. And so DAC is really nice because it gives you compressed CO2. At the end of the whole process, whatever you're doing, you've got your CO2 in a tank and you can literally count the molecules. You know exactly what you have. And that gives people a lot of comfort around those systems. And it also means that if you have a utilization play, if you want to use it for something or whatever, then you've got it and you can do something with it. Having said that, because you're working in that very closed system, your costs are going to be a lot higher. They're just by default, right? Our system is optimized to never have, we're trying to touch as little as we can in the process, because carbon removal is fundamentally a mass movement problem, right? You're moving a gigaton of stuff, right? And so if you never have to touch the stuff you're moving, which is how our system works, the ocean does all the work for us, you're removing a lot of the energy from the system at the end of the day. And so the trade-offs are, you're working in an open environment and all this kind of stuff, but the costs are always going to be significantly lower for a process like ours if you're putting your projects in the right places where the alkalinity exists and all this other stuff. And so I think that's really the trade of all of these things. We've just done an analysis at gigatonne-scale that's going through a review right now that shows our cost of removal at about $17 a ton. And that assumes a 1.5 million ton per year plant. So it's a fairly big system for us, but it also is using a waste product that typically the industrial producer would pay to dispose of. And so we had to show a positive cost of removal because otherwise it's not financially additional, but it could in theory also be a negative cost of removal. So, for our system, when you've got those Goldilocks conditions for a site and a project and all that kind of stuff, the cost can be incredibly low for what we're trying to do. The benefits of the solution are also that it actually has a negative land footprint, which is kind of interesting. So, back to the question about the waste product and the byproduct, what you're actually doing is you're returning land that was otherwise used to store this material. And as you use it, because typically what's happening with this material is it's not sitting and weathering somewhere. What's happening is it's going back into a quarry and piling up. And these piles form a crust of carbonation on the outside of them. So there's no carbonation really happening inside the pile. And so your counterfactual is that this stuff is just going to sit there and be a liability because it's heavily alkaline. And so it's actually a liability and it's going to sit there forever. And so if you can remove it, you're actually going to return land to viable use in a lot of cases. You're going to remediate an environmental hazard. And so the net effect is kind of a negative land use. When we talk about, 30,000 kilometers of coastline, first of all, that'll be spread all around the world. So you wouldn't really even see it any more than exactly where our wastewater plant in Ottawa is discharging. Like, I don't know exactly where that is, right? And it's really going to be like a discharge pipe. Like, it could be under your feet. You wouldn't even know, right? So it's kind of like, even at scale, it's not going to be something you would even really see, I don't think.
The final question of the night was all about building the capital stack. A lot of carbon removal players are part technology companies and part project development, but you win by building projects. So how does Mike think about building the capital stack for a technology like ocean alkalinity enhancement or carbon removal generally? And what words of advice does he have for entrepreneurs on financing strategy, approaching investors, and building the narrative so that they can really trust that you're going to deliver?
So first of all, I don't think it's one size fits all. In climate in particular, I think there's a general narrative that it's CapEx, 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 CapEx. Our system isn't that. We're actually OpEx focused, much more so than CapEx. Like I say, tanks on tarps don't take that much money to build, but operating them does. And that's kind of where we're a little bit different. And I think it's a benefit to scale. If you can sort of like be more, you're not putting all of your cash up front. It's much less risky to be sort of more sort of incremental in terms of how that works, and be scalable in a modular way, I think is a really good way to be as well. So you sort of like build repeatable units that can, glom together so that you don't need $1 billion just to prove your concept, right? And so I would start there. Definitely the capital stack, we've really benefited from, organizations like Shopify, Frontier that have put in early purchases for these technologies. They really go out on a limb and sort of, it's incremental as well, but they'll put in like a little and then a little more and then a little more in order to accelerate the development of your technology and see how it grows and how it works. And then they're incredibly supportive after that as well, which is really helpful. So, policy development, marketing, like all kinds of things like that. And it really forms a really great partnership. For us, working capital, financing, your typical debt structures and things like that are really great. In the carbon space, it's very common for more mature technologies to warehouse their credits. Which essentially means that you get a consolidator to finance a project and then they get all the credits and, sort of go and sell them. They take the sales risk on the credits, which is a really useful financing structure as well. People are calling it carbon streaming now. I don't actually know the difference between that and what everybody's been doing forever, but it sounds cooler. So there we go. So I think there's a wide variety of sort of approaches that you can take. One of the ones I'm really excited about is we're just in the process of working on a project with a company in Japan called Kurita. That's sort of heading towards eventually, hopefully, that they would license our technology and run these projects. So we'll actually get out of the project finance game eventually. And that's where we'd like to get to. But even with this initial project, they're taking on the bulk of the expense of setting it up and actually funding us in order to do our piece of it. And so there's sort of this sort of paid pilot type of model as well that I think is a really valuable approach for climate tech. But maybe I'll pivot your question a little bit away from traditional capital stack and just say, you can't do any of this in isolation. Like, I think that if we have one superpower, it's like partnerships. And that is absolutely necessary across the board. Nothing you do with these big systems as a startup is going to be done alone. And it has to be done with, really what I call structural partnerships where both parties truly care about the outcome and where they're really accretive in terms of how they work. And that is going to be a really big deal. Like, we had our quarterly business review with Nova Scotia Power yesterday, and like, these guys, they will just do stuff for us. Like, they just kind of like, we're on their site and they'll come by, they'll be like, hey, is that okay? Like, do you guys need like a piece of scaffolding there or something like that? And we'll be like, well, I guess that could be helpful. And then somebody will show up and just do it. And you're like, okay. And then you get like things like, when we have our quarterly business reviews, like, a lot of it's like, okay, like, let's walk through your health and safety and how you're making sure that your employees are safe and how the site is safe and all that. We've probably gained, a 5-year head start in, safety policies and safety protocols as a result of just working on that site. And so these partnerships are the things that I think are the things that really accelerate you in this space and reduce your capital needs a lot.
Cool. That's such an interesting perspective too. Like, if you're a partner, you have all these other ways that you can actually be contributing and adding value around the company as well. That isn't just the financing part. Like, leveling up your health and safety is probably something that never would have maybe occurred to either party. I'm going to leave it there because we're short on time. But Mike, thanks so much for spending an evening with us.
Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed today's episode, leave a rating and a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It would mean a lot and helps grow the show. To stay in the loop on Canadian climate tech news, recent fundraising, job postings, events, and more, subscribe to the Climate Tech Canada newsletter on our website. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.